This is concept question 210 from chapter 24's homework, and this time, unlike most of my videos, I'm starting out by showing you the correct answer because I think it helps to see this graph before I explain why it looks the way it looks. So the first part of the question wants us to tell the relationship between a monopolist's marginal revenue and the price of the product. So you see that the correct answer here is that the monopolist's marginal revenue is less than the price of the product. Now, why is that? Let me pull up a whiteboard so that I can show you how this works. So, if you think about our normal aggregate supply and aggregate demand curve. So think about a small business or a business in a perfectly competitive market. Remember, we have looked at their supply and demand curves, and we know that their marginal revenue equals their demand curve. And that's because for a business in a perfectly competitive market, I can't change my price of my product because the market is so big, perfectly competitive market is so large that the price is basically set for me. If I try to make my price any higher or any lower, I basically just get sort of edged out of the market. If I make my price a little bit higher, okay, people go to another business that has the lower price, the market price, and buy their goods. If I make my price a little bit lower, people will come buy me out completely, and I won't have made as much money as I could have if I had increased my price a little bit to the market price. So for each business in a perfectly competitive firm, my price is going to be a horizontal line. No matter what quantity I sell, I have to sell at that price that is determined by the market. And so that price then is my marginal revenue, which makes sense, right? Because for each additional unit that I sell, whatever the price of that unit is how much money I'm bringing in for that unit. So that is my revenue for each additional unit, or the marginal revenue. And it also equals the demand curve, because no matter what quantity the consumers are demanding from me, where quantity is on this axis, remember, the price they're willing to pay is the price that's set by the market. So the key here is that we're in a big, perfectly competitive market where just one little company or firm in that market, don't have control over what the price is, because the market sets the price. I have so many competitors that that my customers will go somewhere else if they don't like my price, or they'll buy me out completely, and I could have raised my price to that market price and made more money. So my price is always this horizontal line, regardless of the quantity demanded from me, or the quantity that I supply, for that matter. So that price line is equal to my marginal revenue, which equals the demand. And this is in a perfectly competitive market. So perfect competitive, perfect competition. There we go. But the question asks about a monopolist's marginal revenue and how that relates to demand. So we know that in a perfectly competitive market, our marginal revenue equals our demand curve, because demand tells us consumers' willingness to pay, and consumers are always willing to pay that price that's set by the market, and that price is our marginal revenue. But let's switch colors here and talk about a monopolist. So a monopolist is the only firm in the entire market for whatever good they're selling or service they're providing. And so the monopolist doesn't have this situation where the market is setting the price for them. In this case, in the monopolist case, the price is set by the demand for the product. And we know from the first couple of chapters from this semester that the demand curve for a product is always downward sloping. So for a monopolist, the demand curve they face is that downward sloping demand for the product, because there's not another firm for the customer to run out to buy the product. Whatever the total market demand is, that's the demand curve that I, the monopolist, will see, because I see all of the demand because I'm the only person providing this good or service. So for a monopolist, demand is the downward sloping demand curve that we're used to from the first couple of chapters of the book before we started talking about aggregate demand. So the question now is, what then happens to the marginal revenue for a monopolist? We know that at perfect competition, the marginal revenue equals the demand. What about for a monopolist? So at this point, I want to pull up your textbook and talk through figure 24-3 on page 560, because I think they really show really well with this figure what happens with the marginal revenue for a monopolist. So this is an example of a ferry boat. So you're the only ferry that's crossing this particular waterway. So you have a monopoly over this waterway. And so you get to choose how many times you want to cross the water. Say you choose 3, for example. You choose you want to cross the river or the water 3 times, which means your price is going to be what? You will always set your price based on what the demanders, the consumers, are willing to pay. And that willingness to pay, remember, is shown by the demand curve. So if you want to cross the river or the water 3 times, you'll go look at the demand curve for a quantity of 3 and figure out what people are willing to pay based on the demand curve. And that willingness to pay turns out in this example to be 8. So if you want to provide 3 crossings, then you'll charge $8 per crossing, because that's the consumer's willingness to pay for a quantity of 3. Therefore, your total revenue is going to be those 3 crossings times $8 each. So your total revenue is 3 times 8, or $24. So I'll go write that down so we can compare it. Oh, no, I don't want to clear the page. I want a new page. Okay, so if we choose to provide 3 trips, our revenue, total revenue, equals 3 times 8, or $24. Alright, so this is an equal sign. I know it's ugly. Excuse my handwriting. Okay, so let's go back to our book and look at what happens if we decide then we want to add 1 more trip. So I want to go up to 4 trips. Now I have to go to the demand curve again and figure out what I need to charge per trip. So if I want to take 4 trips, the demand curve says people are willing to pay $7 per trip if I'm offering 4 trips. So now my revenue, because I can't offer a different price per trip, so I can't say, oh, the first trip is going to cost $10, second trip's going to cost $9. I have to, just because this is how businesses work, right? We know this. You can't go to the store and say, and have the cashier tell you, no, I haven't sold any bags of chips yet today, so your bag of chips costs $10. Where the second person, the person behind you in line, will have to pay less than that because they choose a different price per bag of chips. That's not how it works, right? So at the beginning of the day, you decide how many times you want to cross the water, and based on that, you have to set a price. That's the price for every trip. So if you want to go 3 times, your price per trip is 8. Now that I've decided I want to go 4 times, my price per trip has to be 7 based on the demand curve. So now, what's my revenue? Now my revenue is those 4 trips times $7, right? Because I'll make $7 per trip, and I'll take 4 trips. So now my revenue, if I take 4 trips, my total revenue, TR, equals 4 times 7, which is $28. So, we've made a total extra for going from 3 trips to 4 trips. We've made $4 more. And that is the definition of marginal revenue, right? So the marginal revenue for the 4th trip is how much we made from taking 4 trips minus how much we made from taking 3 trips. So that's the additional revenue we make by increasing our number of trips 1 time. And in this case, that's 28 minus 24. So our marginal revenue is 4, right? And they show that on the graph in the textbook by showing that when you go from 3 to 4, the additional revenue you gain is that 1 extra trip times the price of that trip, which was 7, right? So bring in that $7 for that extra trip. But because we had to lower the price for all of our trips, rather than when we had 3 trips, we were charging $8 for each trip, now we're only charging $7 for each trip. So for those first 3 trips, we're losing $1 on each of those trips. So our total loss from going from 3 trips to 4 trips is represented by this green rectangle, which is $3, because we actually lose $1 on each of the first trips, right? Because we're charging $7 each rather than $8 each now. So we lose those $3 on the first 3 trips, but then we gain $7 from taking the 4th trip. So our overall total gain is that $7 minus the $3. Our total gain is the $4. And that's how much actual extra we make by taking a 4th trip than we would have made by just taking 3 trips. So our marginal revenue for that 4th trip is $4, which, of course, is less than 7, which was our price on the demand curve. So this little example shows us that our marginal revenue is actually less than our price, and the price is set by the demand curve. So this is how we know. This little example shows us, and this would work for any general example. This example shows us why the marginal revenue curve is always below or less than the demand curve, because the demand curve sets our price, and for a monopolist, when we choose our number of trips or our number of units that we're going to sell or provide, we also have to choose a price based on the demand curve. And in choosing that price, we both gain some and lose some. So our total marginal revenue, is always less than our price. And so that tells us why, we can go back to our original question here and our answer here. That tells us why the marginal revenue is always less than the price of the product, and why in the picture our marginal revenue curve, which is this straight line here, is always going to be to the left of or less than our demand curve. Now in part 2, I'll show you why it starts in the same place as the demand curve.